I have an 8-year-old daughter, and one of the challenges that I have is trying to teach her about God, but not through the channels of organized religion.
Yes.
And so this is my church, you know. And so I'd like to know how you would advise parents to teach our children about how to get in touch with their emotions in the moment so that they can continue to be aware of their soul condition.
Yeah, I can briefly answer that question for you right now if you wish. The feeling I have is that most parents are not aware that God's created this beautiful universe where we can teach our children about God every single moment of the day. That everything in the universe is geared to teach us about God. The complexity of life that's around us, the creation and its integral power and also complexity, is such a great way to just engage your children with constantly and ask them questions about how do you think that got here? Who do you think put it here? Where did this intelligence come from? And actually engaging them in this process of teaching them about life. You see, when you do that, the emotions become a secondary issue to their progress. And the reality is our emotions are, in reality, a secondary issue to our progress. I feel for a lot of people, when I talk about emotions, most people then go, oh, well, I've got to do the emotional work, I've got to do the emotional work. But actually, the emotional work is a secondary issue. It's more about desire for God and desire for truth and having humility, and emotions are a part of humility. So while dealing with your emotions are an important part of your progression towards God, if your focus is just to teach the child emotions, or about emotions, then firstly you're going to miss some very basic truths. One is, your child knows how to express its emotions better than you do. So it's going to be quite impossible for you to teach your child about emotions and emotional work. It's probably better to watch what your child does and learn from them. Yes. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So it's impossible to really teach your child about the proper expression of emotions when you yourself are quite shut down emotionally. The reality is, what you need to teach them are the things you can teach them. One of the things you can teach them is this connection with the universe around them. Now, I don't know what it's like for most of you here in the USA, but every person we've met in the USA generally is quite disconnected from nature, quite disconnected from, the outside world, and we see that quite a lot in most Western civilizations. You see this very strong disconnection from nature. But nature tells us so much about God. The more we find out about nature, the more we find out how amazingly complex and beautiful everything is that God's created. Now, if you engage your child in that process of questioning them and getting them to question their environment in the same way, look at their environment, ask themselves some basic questions about intelligence and so forth, what's there, where did it come from, and get them feeling about those things. And then take the opportunities when they're available, when they ask questions. So, Mummy, do you think God exists? Then you can say, well, I don't really know, actually. I think I look at the creation around me, if this is your opinion. You say, I look at the creation around me, I think, yes, God definitely exists, but I don't always feel a personal connection with God, so that, that makes it then difficult. So you can then have these really honest and truthful conversations with your child about that. The second area that's really good to work on with your child is teaching them how to use their free will in a loving manner. In other words, always engaging, teaching them how they can do their life with every choice that they've made, and make sure that every choice that they made has love as its basis. If you do those two particular things, your children will end up with a very strong relationship with God. Just those two things.
I kind of see it that God has created everything in our existence, like everything that God has created is designed to teach us about Him and about us. So all of His laws are also in operation on us all of the time, as well as looking at nature. There's all of these things that are happening as we engage our will to give us feedback. So I feel like the best thing a parent can do to teach them about God is to teach them how to learn, basically, from God, which is to observe. And now you have some knowledge of the laws, is to help them understand the laws and help them recognize the laws in action in their life, because those are the things that are going to help them eternally grow and eternally have their relationship with God. And then they're going to know God on their own. So you don't actually have to teach them about God. You can teach them about the way God's designed for them to connect to God, and then.
Yes, that's really what I wanted. I just want to point her in the right direction, so that she's not confused, because I was confused growing up. So it's really just important to, I guess maybe look for something tangible, which is right outside your back door.
Exactly.
So there's
Your
no
backyard.
book that I need to find, or there's no,
No.
whatever.
Can I give you an illustration of it? Would somebody like to be my guinea pig? Anybody like to come down here and be my guinea pig? Marina, you're going to have to come down here. If we
Big
hand up-
control on the guinea pig guy.
You're allowed to renege from the agreement. You're allowed to say, it's all right. And you can smile and breathe, because nothing's going to happen to you. How tall are you? So 5 foot 8 inches. Is that how you write it? Yeah. And what's that in centimetres? Do you know? We might grab a mic actually, if one of the mics can come down here, and so that 174. You think it is? I'm not sure.
173, 172.
173, 174, something like that. Centimetres. Yeah. Okay. Right. So that's her height. So you don't have to do anything here. It's not major. That's her height to the ground, right? Did you know that there is a mathematical equation that actually will tell me where her belly button is? And there is a mathematical equation, if you hold out your arm, that will tell me how long her shoulder, from her shoulder point to the tip of her fingers will be, and where her elbow will be, and where her wrist will be, and where her fingers will be, right? And it's all the same mathematical equation. Did you know that? Now, isn't that amazing? Right? And we'll write the mathematical equation in a minute. And you can do an experiment on yourself when you go home. And if there is any disproportion in this equation, it's because of an emotional injury you have, actually, which is very interesting. Because the average person will have the perfect equation, and if there's any disproportion in any of these things, then it will be based on some kind of emotional injury that's present. So if you also go from the hip down to the foot, there'll be the same equation, points at the knee, and also at the ankle point, where the ankle joint is, and the length of the foot, and everything is all determined by these equations. Did you know that? No? And did you know that the same equation exists in a pine cone and a pineapple, and quite a number of other things? Now, if we think back to our teaching our child, see, these are things that we can easily teach our child and then get them to question. Why is this proportion, this perfectly proportioned person here? Why is it, why are you crying about that? This perfectly proportional person, why do they have these proportions, and why do we all think this particular proportion looks good? And when somebody's out of proportion, it doesn't look good to us. Why is that? And you could ask your child, well, why do you think that is? Where did all this mathematics come from? If we just evolved like a lot of people say, then where did all this mathematics come from? Like, it's a bit like saying, this house, which had to be designed by somebody, didn't have a designer at all, and this room didn't have a designer, but it all come just from an explosion. Have you noticed any explosion ever do that for you? Oh, I haven't noticed one do that for me. Usually when you drop something, it goes everywhere. It doesn't go, oh, I'm being dropped now. I think I'll have some intelligence and put myself back together again. And this is a beautiful thing that we can teach our children. And this is an example of what I'm trying to say is that when we often don't do this with our child, right? And we're so worried about teaching about emotions and teaching. But firstly, I feel one of the greatest things we can teach our child is that God exists, and you have a potential to be able to connect to God through a process. But if they have no confidence that God exists, how can you ever teach them to connect to God through a process? We've got to first have some kind of confidence that God exists. And these kind of things, the mathematics in the proportion of a body. Thanks, Marina. That was easy, wasn't it? Nothing to cry about.
I wanted to say something. I wanted to say something as an artist, because I like to draw and paint.
Yes.
And when it comes to children, because I do a lot with children, it's interesting. Even mathematically, we measure a head from here, and you can approximate where the heart or the chest would be. You take another head and you put it down, and a couple of heads reaches your belly button.
Where the nose appears, where the bridge appears.
Exactly.
The distance of the mouth between the mouth and the chin and the nose. Right. Everything is mathematically proportional.
And the great thing about children is they never question it.
Yeah.
They just are like, okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, exactly.
That's good. Where did this come from? Over here somewhere. So what I'm illustrating by that is that you see, oftentimes as parents we sort of lack some imagination in a way, because we have a world at our fingertips of things that we can teach our children, that are very powerful things that we can teach our children. And yet what do we do with that world? Instead of teaching our children, look, these are all, proof that there is some order and creative order in our entire universe. Instead of teaching our child that, we ignore a lot of the creative order ourselves on our day-to-day life, and we go through the mundane process of just having our life. Getting up in the morning, taking them to school, picking them up at night, taking them to music practice, bringing them home from that, taking them to soccer or football or whatever, and bringing them home from that, and we're all exhausted. We never get to talk about the real things that matter. We have, busy internet lives, busy, machine lives, and all of which don't teach anything, most of them. Very little of it teaches anything that benefits the soul. And if we embraced a teaching process that actually benefited the soul, benefited and satisfied the emotional desire to know truth, and then we have great ability to have that child within a very few years already experimenting with their own relationship with God. And after the time they're 5 or 6 years of age, they won't even need you. Isn't that great? Many of you want them to need you for the rest of their existence, yes? But they potentially, if we educate our child with all of these skills, potentially by the time they're 6 years of age, they'll be able to cook for themselves, clean for themselves, tidy up their room for themselves, live in their own house, because their law of attraction would be pretty good, wouldn't it? Being close to God, and money-wise, everything would just flow. So, unlike it does for us, they could even live in their own house. And what I've recommended to some parents is that if you've got a bigger yard, you just build a house for them at the back, and they potentially could have their own food, their own, everything looked after by the time they're 5, 6, 7 years of age, where they don't need you anymore. And most of us would be quite resistive to that, because we like people needing us. Why do we do that? Because we have an addiction of it causes us to feel like we have value. Right? And if we actually brought up our children so they didn't need us, we would wonder what our value was. For many of us, we'd wonder what our value was. So I'd recommend that any person with a child, we need to teach them these life skills. During that process, we'll teach them mathematics, we'll teach them science, we'll teach them all sorts of principles. Yeah, it'd be so wonderful. Yeah. By the way, the proportion is, for this, if you get a number system and you add the two previous numbers together, you'll get a system that goes like this. Oops, sorry, can't add up. And so forth. That, by the way, has been given a series called the Fibonacci series of numbers. And very simple series of numbers, but interestingly enough, if you get the larger number and divide it by the smaller number, you will get a number that approximates this. And the further you go on in the series, the closer it gets to that particular number. And interestingly, if you get the height of the person, 74 centimetres for Marina, times it by 0.618, you'll get the height of her belly button. So good. And if you get the length of the person's arm and times it by 0.618, you'll get the distance from the tip of their finger to their elbow. Same applies from the hip to the foot. And the same applies with the length of your head to where your nose appears at the top and the bottom. And every other relationship that's actually in your body, believe it or not. And interestingly enough, if the pine cone, if you get a pine cone and you count the rotations that it has in one direction and the rotations it has in another direction, you'll find there is 8 rotations in one direction and 13 rotations in the other direction. And if you get a pineapple, you'll find that the rotations are 13 and 21. You'll also find that if you calculate the rotational angle between these two particular numbers, you'll find that wherever most plants grow, and where they place a leaf is actually at that point of the rotational angle. And the reason why that is because that's the point where if there is an infinite or a large number of branches, each one will receive the most light that it possibly can at that angle. If you look at a sunflower seed head, you'll find that it's got a rotational angles the same, but the rotational angles are right up in the hundreds with each seed, but it still meets the count of the Fibonacci series of numbers. And then the question is, well, where did all that come from? All that design. Where did it all come from? So, you know, and you could just leave the question with the child, couldn't you? Because I think you don't really need to say anything more than that, and they can then wonder and feel about that themselves. Interestingly enough, have any of you ever learnt that at school? No. Isn't that
One
very
person.
interesting? One
Yep.
person? You did. You teach it at school. Okay, okay, that's wonderful. Yeah, yeah. In the arts, of course, it is taught in the arts, but most people, when they've been to school, have never been taught those particular things. Engineering, it's occasionally taught, yes, and particularly because of densities. Like in terms of the density of packing, these are the numbers that are all the ideal densities with regard to packing, and so sometimes in engineering it's taught. But it's pretty rare to have it taught at school, isn't it? You think most of us, there's probably 60 or 70 of us here now, and one of us teaches it at school, but most of us have never heard it at school. We've heard it through our own reading or something else. And the reason why do you think that is? Isn't that weird? Don't you find that weird? Something that could actually give us confidence in the existence of a designer in the universe, and yet it appears to be a pretty fundamental thing to understand, and yet our own bodies are built by the proportion of it, so fairly fundamental thing to understand about ourselves, and yet it's not taught. You've got to start questioning then, well, why is it not taught? Interesting. Maybe there is an investment in everyone not believing in God after all.
Maybe there's just an arrogance that we know how to do things better than God does.
Yeah.
AJ gave a really awesome, I think it's on the net now, isn't it, babe? The discussion you had with Justin.